This is a short economics revision video about macroeconomic policy indicators, which goes with the national economy part of economics AS level with AQA. It basically gives you an introduction to employment, economic growth, price stability and balance of payments, and then we'll come on to them in more detail in subsequent videos. We have the 4 targets or goals that the government wants to achieve, which are full employment, economic growth and thus a higher standard of living, control of inflation, so price stability, and satisfactory balance of payments. And the government tries to get these to be at the level they wish by using policy instruments, which are the fiscal policy, monetary policy and supply side policy. But we don't need to worry about those now, we'll come on to them much later in a different video. Full employment is one of the government's objectives. What are the benefits of full employment? Well, there's an increased standard of living, because obviously people have got more money, they can spend more, they've got higher materialistic standard of living, they're feeling a bit more confident in themselves, so less risk of mental illness, stuff like that. It reduces human suffering, because obviously unemployed people, they don't tend to be as happy, they tend to have social anxiety sometimes, depression, a higher rate of crime, stuff like that. If we've got more people employed, we have more tax payments, more people are paying income tax, that's really good, and we're spending less on welfare payments like benefits, because there are fewer people that are unemployed and are thus claiming these benefits. Then we come on to the costs of unemployment. Obviously there are many problems for the unemployed. There's economic problems because they haven't got any money, so they can't afford very much. Social problems, they tend to get excluded by society, they could go out to commit crime, they get quite depressed, I suppose that comes into health problems. Depression is a big one there. There can be splits up of marriages and stuff as a result of unemployment, leading to financial tensions within families. And the government obviously suffers with its budget when there's unemployment because it gets reduced money in from income tax and has to spend more on welfare benefits. So that could potentially lead to a budget deficit. So how could the government achieve full employment? Well, one method it could use to achieve full employment would be by increasing aggregate demand, as we've shown on the diagram there. I've chosen to use a Keynesian diagram because I find it so much better for showing the effects of the increases in AD on inflation, and we'll see why, because from AD1 to AD2 we've got increased employment, but there's only a small change in the price level, whilst from AD2 to AD3 there's not much greater employment, but there's a considerably higher rate of price level, so there's very inflationary from AD2 to AD3, so that's a negative effect of the government trying to achieve full employment by shifting the AD curve. The reason that this shift in AD would lead to increased employment would be a positive multiplier effect. As demand increases, more labour is required to produce the products to meet this demand. And obviously, if we get to full employment, it means we'll have to start importing more, so that's a risk. If we increase aggregate demand by too much, we'll start importing loads. And if we're importing a lot, that's not very good for our balance of payment. The government could also achieve full employment by shifting the LRAS curve to the right. It'd probably use supply-side policies, which are education and training, stuff like that. We'll come on to these in more detail when we do all the policies. And supply-side policies, particularly education and training, make labour more employable, so workers are more likely to be able to get a job, so there'll be more employment because of that. Also, if we're producing more, because our capacity to produce is increased, we'll need more workers to help as part of this big increase in capacity, because we can't just have more machines, we're going to need more workers to operate these machines. And the benefit of achieving full employment by shifting the LRAS curve is that there is reduced inflation. As you can see there, going down from LRAS1 to LRAS2 has caused an extension of the AD curve and has thus caused the price level to fall within the economy, which is really good for the UK because it makes it more competitive, woo! So we can compete internationally because our prices are lower. Productivity. Productivity for labour is output per worker per period of time, and total factor productivity is the overall productivity of inputs used by firms in producing a particular level of output. And if we increase our productivity, it causes the LRAS curve to shift right, which is obviously good because we can produce more. It means that we can have the same amount of workers producing more in the same time period, and so because we're producing more in the same time period, the LRAS curve has shifted right because we've got a greater capacity to produce, because we're producing more with the same inputs. I mean, on the one hand, this could lead to some people becoming unemployed because maybe we don't want to reach this total level of output because there's no demand for it, and we just need the few workers. We need fewer workers to produce the same amount of output. But it could be deemed to be a positive because it means we've released workers who can increase production elsewhere. Moving on now to the joys of economic growth. We've got benefits and costs of economic growth, and you can see the list there. We're going to go for benefits first. There's a rise in material living standards. This is because the GDP is rising faster than the population, so this is only when there's an increase in GDP per capita. So everyone has more to spend on average, and that means they're materially better off. I mean, it doesn't mean that in terms of how much love they receive, their family, their friends, they're better off, but it means that in terms of possessions, they have more. So citizens can take holidays and eat out. Lucky people. Then we have the rise in the welfare of the population. Because the capacity of the economy to produce more grows, the government is able to devote more resources to services such as health and education, which improves the general welfare of the country. This is especially because they're getting more corporation tax from firms, because that's tax on profits, by the way. So firms are making more profits because they're producing more, so government can take more of their money. This is really important in developing countries, where progress can include increase in life expectancy and a greater literacy rate because of this increase in spending on health and education. Then we have a rise in employment and a fall in unemployment. A rise in output means that more workers are required for production, so the unemployment rate drops, and for reasons that we've already mentioned, this is really good. And we have a reduction in poverty because output and incomes rise. Obviously, we've got more employed people paying income tax. So the government can take taxes from the rich people and give it to raise the living standards of those with lower incomes, for example, in welfare benefits. So Robin Hood style there. Then we come on to the costs of economic growth, alas. Inflation. Sometimes the rate of growth can be too fast for the economy to respond without a rise in general price level. So maybe economic growth leads to more people being employed, so there's a massive increase in demand, aggregate demand, and as we've seen before, if there's a massive increase in aggregate demand, this could lead to a rise in price level. Then we've got what, in my opinion, is the worst possible point. We have a lower quality of life. I mean, this would be okay if you could support it with some really strong evidence, but we've only got that economic growth can change people's lifestyles quite considerably, and some people might move to the city where they'll face stress. I mean, yes, some people do get stressed in the city, and maybe they've moved there because there are jobs there because of economic growth, but this is like the worst point possible, and only use this if this is the only point you can actually think of. Then we have the inequalities of income and wealth. The benefits of growth are often unevenly spread, so there's a massive gap between rich and poor, particularly in third world countries, where you'll have some people that take all the money and leave the rest in poverty. So you'll have some very rich people, but most people will be very poor. We have congestion. Economic growth is often concentrated in a certain urban area, and these areas can become overcrowded. So there's pressure on the local services like hospitals, pressure on the roads, because if there's lots and lots of people in one area on the road, you get congestion and traffic, and it's horrible. And then we come on to our environmental costs, which come under the category of environmental costs. So that would be pollution, because there's more output, more pollution, more road transport, more pollution. And obviously we've got this all worldwide, that leads to global warming. And then we have our environmental stuff, which is loss of non-renewable resources, because economic growth uses many resources that can't be replaced, like oil and metal and minerals. And many trees are also cut to increase timber output, and when these trees are cut down, it leads to many animals and plants being made endangered. So it's really tragic, the costs of economic growth. So you've got to think about all of this if you're writing an essay on economic growth. Though to be honest, an essay just comparing the benefits and costs of economic growth is more GCSE Unit 2, I think, than AS level, sadly. The trend rate of economic growth can be increased through a right shift of the LRES. Obviously, if we've got a right shift of the LRES, it means that we can produce more, we've got capacity to produce more, so there'll be an increase in output, hopefully. And the reasons that we'll get this will be from supply-side factors, and that will be particularly from government supply-side policies, which we'll look at in a later video. Inflation is a persistent rise in average prices in the economy. There are two big types of inflation: demand pull and cost push. Demand pull is when demand is above the rate of production, so if there's greater demand, so there's excess demand I suppose, that means that prices have to rise to meet this demand and get rid of any excess demand. So that'll be demand pull inflation. And cost push inflation is when there's a rise in costs of production. I suppose supply side shock could lead to excessive cost push inflation, but workers pushing for greater wages, that'll be a wage price spiral, which is when workers ask for higher wages and then cost of living rises for everyone, so everyone asks for more and more higher wages, and that's serious inflation, cost push. And obviously rising cost of production leads to rising prices, and that's inflation. Deflation is basically the opposite, which is a persistent fall in prices in the economy, and consumers will hold off buying and wait for prices to fall further, which is obviously really bad because if we've got no demand, this leads to a negative multiplier effect, so we'll have a loss of employment, so unemployment basically. Then we might have a tight labour market. This could lead to inflation because firms will increase their wages to attract the desired labour. So basically, if there's a tight labour market, it means there's not that many people around looking for jobs, so firms will try to attract the few people that are looking for jobs with higher wages, or try to snatch people from other companies by increasing wages, and obviously increasing wages increases cost of production, cost push inflation I suppose, so that's how that leads to inflation. Here are the costs of inflation as you'd expect. Inflation is really hard on some social groups. That's people that are stuck on fixed incomes, like those on minimum wage. So if you're working in a fast food restaurant, often inflation's quite hard on you because your wages won't rise to keep up with inflation. And people like pensioners, they're getting a specific pension. £10 a week, whatever they get, isn't going to be enough when inflation means that the price of living is £20 a week. Obviously, they're distorted figures and they get a bit more, I hope, and price of living's a bit more. But you know what I mean. And those with weak bargaining power also suffer. So some professions have no real power, so they don't have strong trade unions. I mean, teachers have got very strong trade unions, but there'll be some professions with less strong trade unions who won't be able to fight to get their workers higher pay. So they will also be stuck on lower income and their wages won't be able to keep up with the cost of living. Inflation also redistributes income from the lenders to the borrowers, because the lenders lose out, so they'll raise the cost of borrowing. I mean, basically lenders lose out because they'll lend someone some money and then the value of the money will fall because less can be bought for the same amount of money, so when they get the money paid back to them, it won't be worth as much, so borrowers actually gain in times like this. Anyway, going back to this, lenders will lose out, so they'll end up raising the cost of borrowing, try to cancel out the effect of the inflation. So investment will slow down because funds are more expensive, because borrowings you have to pay back more, there's a higher interest rate, so people will stop borrowing to invest. If we're investing less, we'll have reduced economic growth, which obviously isn't that good for the economy. Then we have the distortion of behaviour by economic agents. People think, oh, there's going to be inflation, so they'll anticipate inflation, so they're going to buy lots, and that'll increase aggregate demand, and this aggregate demand will further increase inflation, and that'll bring about fears of unemployment, so people will start saving and they're going to reduce their spending, and that'll lead to a very rapid fall in aggregate demand, which, as we all know, leads to an inflation. Not so good. Workers will also anticipate inflation and demand wage rises, and we've discussed this already, that's a wage price spiral. Finally, there'll be an increased balance of payments deficit, sadly, because our UK goods, our exports are going to be expensive because of our inflation, and imports are going to seem cheap. So we're going to import more and export, that's what I want. Export less, and we know that's a balance of payments deficit, which is not very good, sadly, because it means that money is leaving the economy. It's going out of the flow of income, stuff like that. Then we have the reason for inflation target. The target of the government is 2% inflation. I think we're slightly below that at the moment, like 1.7% or something. But we have a target of 2%, and this takes into account the improvement of goods and services over time, which encourages firms to innovate. Because obviously a phone today, I mean, my phone's pretty rubbish, it's probably the same as phones 10 years ago, but a phone today is going to be much better than phones 10 years ago. I mean, they were bricks, now we have the iPhones and stuff like that. Even however much I hate the iPhone, you've got to admit it's a good piece of technology. And also, we don't want there to be deflation. We cannot risk that happening, because that's just so bad for the economy. It slows it right down, leads to mass unemployment. Really not good. And now we have the balance of payments. We've got 3 lovely terms here in bright, colourful letters. Letters? What the hell am I on about? I mean numbers. No, colours. Oh, I need to get to sleep. Balance of payments, lots of terms in bright colours. So we have the balance of payments, which makes me laugh every time. That's when expenditure is equal to income. So the amount that we're spending on imports is equal to the amount that people abroad are spending on our exports. Then we come on to the balance of payments deficit, which is when our expenditure is greater than our income, sadly. So that leads to an outflow of money because we are spending more on imports than people abroad are spending on our exports, and that's the situation we've been in for quite a while. Although we have got a balance of payments surplus in services, we've got a balance of payments deficit in trade. Not trade, yeah, trade of tangible goods, so goods basically. And a balance of payments surplus, woo! Which is when income is greater than expenditure, which leads to an inflow of money because we are spending less on imports than people abroad are spending on our exports, whee! And this leads to injections into circular flow of income. Woo! So everyone's richer and happier, materialistically better off, essentially. And now we come to the question on everyone's mind. Why is there a balance of payments deficit? The first reason is industry changes. So there's a massive increase in the amount that we're importing from China or India or whatever because it's cheaper. So some of our industries are collapsing. Our manufacturing industry in particular, it's shrinking down. I mean, something we do in class is everyone sees where all their items of stationery, their clothing comes from. You get it from all over the world: Vietnam, Turkey, China. But you hardly get any from England, although I think my blazer was made in England, so check that out. And not only are these goods cheaper, but we've also got the appetite from them, because quite a lot of goods from abroad contain like furs and stuff that we can't acquire in this country. Why you'd want to wear furs is beyond me, but we see these as luxury goods imported from abroad, so we buy them, we lap them up. I mean, Swiss chocolate, everyone wants Swiss chocolate. I prefer green and black, dark chocolate 85% personally, but Swiss chocolate is something we all appeal to. Wines especially, foreign wines, France, Australia, New Zealand, that's the places we go to get wines, because they're simply so much better than the ones we get in the UK. And finally, we have the rate of interest, which is to do with the exchange rate, essentially. So I'm going to go through this, and hopefully you'll be able to understand it, because it's something that I think is really fascinating and also quite important. So when our rate of interest is much higher than that of our trading partners, obviously at the moment we're quite low, but often it's quite a lot higher than our trading partners, bank deposits in the UK seem more attractive. People think, oh, I'll put my money there, and that means that I'll get more back, because if our rate of interest is higher, I get a better reward for saving. So deposits abroad are moved to the UK, so the old currency is sold and people buy the pound. That leads to an increase in demand for the pound, and so the price of the pound rises. So that means the pound has got a greater value, which means there's a stronger exchange rate, and when the exchange rate is stronger, imports are cheaper and exports are more expensive. Hence, there is a balance of payments deficit, because we will import more and export less. The credit crunch is a term we've all heard, but what is it? I don't know. But I do now, because I can see it right in front of me. And also there, I'm really annoyed because some of those numbers have been coloured in, and I tried so hard to get them in black, but they just kept wanting to go to red, so I just had to leave it. Anyway, a credit crunch is when borrowing becomes more expensive or unavailable, so people simply can't borrow, firms can't borrow to invest, which leads to a massive, slowing down of production. We can't produce as much, machinery starts going out of date, we can't get new firms because firms simply can't borrow money to have startup costs, stuff like that. That leads to a deficit which starts to grow. So the overseas investors no longer wish to hold money in the UK because they become uncertain about UK prospects, and then the foreign banks actually start to refuse to lend money to UK firms. The UK government sees this as quite an issue, and it starts thinking, oh, we need to try to reduce our deficit, so it'll cut its domestic spending to reduce demand in the UK for imports, because it wants to retain all of its money in circular flow of income. So it will cut domestic spending. Obviously, not only does that reduce the amount of money people have disposable income which they'll spend on imports, it also reduces the amount people have to spend on products and services that were actually produced within the UK itself. So we'll have reduced economic growth, because why produce goods and services when there's no demand for them, and people have to be laid off because people aren't needed to produce goods that we're not producing. So that'll lead to rising unemployment, and as we've seen before, both of those things have really negative effects on the economy and the people within it. That is the end of this video. Woo, we've made it! We're going to have more videos later with more detail in each of those sections, except for inflation. For some reason there's no video for that. I mean, I've made the PowerPoints for all of the others, but there simply wasn't the information there to make another video on inflation, so you've only got videos on the other three, and I suppose you just don't need to know the stuff for inflation. You probably don't care about that, so I hope this video helped. Have a lovely day, evening, morning, whatever time of the day it is. Goodbye!